I'm sure there are different locations, different times of the day, different weather. It's pretty miserable here in Scotland. So, yeah, so today I will talk about qualitative research. I'll start sharing my screen in a second. Just before I do, I think just to organize it better. So, I think I have 1 hour for this, right? Then we have 30 minutes for Q&A. I would ideally like you to put your questions in the chat rather than raising hands or asking, because I mean, unless it's absolutely essential, it's just going to be easier. Also, I'll be sharing my screen, so I won't always know what the question is. Plus, I think it's just better for everybody if we go through roughly what we need to go through first, and then I'll do my best, and I always do, to answer every single question. But just for for the flow, for others to enjoy it, I think it's best to go through the presentation first, and then just discuss everything, all the questions that you have. So so do put them in the comments straight away, in the chat. I mean, as they come to your mind, so you don't forget them later. So I can, the moment I finish, I can look at the questions. If there is anything urgent, of course, you're all muted anyway. But if there's something really urgent, just unmute yourself and just start talking, because again, I'll be looking at the presentation screen, so I won't see the chat anyway. So if there is something urgent, and by urgent I mean, I don't know, just anything. I remember I was giving recently a presentation for a training for how to use NVivo software for data analysis, and only at the end of the training, after an hour, somebody said they can't see my screen, which is ridiculous. I don't know how that happened, and nobody told me before that. So that was a useless training, but basically. So yeah, but hopefully there is no such problem. So let me just share the presentation now. There isn't much detail in the presentation. I'm not the biggest fan of slideshows, but just so we have something to look at, there is a little presentation. So it is about qualitative research, of course. That's what we will talk about different procedures and common problems. Of course, I won't be able to give you everything that you need, every single detail of qualitative research in 1 hour. But what I'll do, try, is to make it as practical as possible. That's why I'm focusing on common problems and procedures, because there's a lot of stuff that you can find in textbooks, online, and lectures, but they are kind of generic. So that's why, the core of my presentation are the problems. This is based on all my interactions with students over the years, and things I know tend to confuse people and cause problems. So that's what we'll talk about. A little presentation outline, so I'll very briefly add to whatever needs to add it about myself, and then we'll talk about qualitative research. I'll also mention quantitative research, just to make sure that we know the difference, and then we'll have 30 minutes. Again, I strongly encourage you to ask me any questions that you have about research, because that's my favorite part, definitely, to talk about specific things that you want to know, and your problems. Yeah, so again, most of it I think has been said. So that's where I've done my degrees, here in Scotland, in Edinburgh. I did a little bit of teaching at the University of Edinburgh as well. At the moment, I teach online with different institutions, as well as lots of other things. So I have been a research consultant, which does mean that I work with individual students, with institutions, with companies such as banks, HSBC, Volvo as a car manufacturer, lots of things. All of it is heavily relevant and deeply relevant to qualitative research. That's definitely my area of expertise. Not so much quantitative research, not so much. So I'll briefly mention it, but I'm really not great with numbers. Let's just get straight into it. So what is research first? What is research? It may sound obvious, but it's meant to be, applicable to and universal and relevant to all sorts of learners. And so I don't want to take anything for granted or assume that everybody understands what we're talking about, because in fact, when I was starting my education at the University of Edinburgh, I remember I did not know what research is, and we had this research class, and they started talking about research and all these things, and I literally just needed to know what even is research. So that's why, very briefly, I'll talk about this. So basically, systematic investigation into something. That's what research is. Investigation to answer certain questions in a systematic way. And this is very important that it's systematic, because to do research is also a very overused expression, especially these days online. People often say, I did my research, or do your research first. And whilst it's probably some sort of research, unstructured, unofficial, semi-formal research, this is not exactly what actual research is. So it's very important that it's systematic, follows certain steps. I broke this down into 3 major steps, which would be: you pose a question that you need answered, because that's always at the core of every research study. You need the whole goal is to answer a question. There is no other way. You want to answer a question. Doesn't matter what kind of methods, methodology, research design you're using. You would not be doing that research if you don't need to answer certain questions. So you pose that question, you plan the study, including who has answers to these questions. How can I answer these questions? Who do I need to approach, or what sort of data do I need to gather? So you're planning the study, then you collect the data, answering the research question, and the data you need for answering the research question, and then you analyze the data to find the answer. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what a qualitative study is. And what I mean at the bottom by saying we're natural born researchers is because we have this curiosity. We want to answer things, certain questions. You can see that in kids. If you have kids, or you've been, obviously everybody has been a kid at some point, with experiments, breaking things, throwing things against walls. It's all research just to see what happens. So we're definitely natural born researchers. And now the key research design. So the broadest classification when we start talking about research, or what kind of research we're doing, would be the classification into qualitative research, quantitative research, and mixed methods research. These are the 3 major types. Whether you call them designs, some people call them approaches, some even call them methods. Don't worry about it, because that's one of the, I guess, key messages. Not something I included in any of this particular slides, but terminology and confusion that it causes is definitely among the key sources of confusion. When I talk to students, it's always about terminology. Somebody calls qualitative research a method, somebody calls it a design. Then, especially when it goes into data analysis, there is so much confusion as well. My advice in general is always follow one classification. If you have an author, or you're learning from a book where they call qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research a research design, just follow that classification all the way through. Mention, obviously, reference that author, mention who said that and why you're following that classification, because then somebody will point it out and say it's not a design, it's a research approach. So there is always so many ways to talk about the same things, but generally, and the classification I have been using is research design: qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. So very quickly, because we won't talk about quantitative research too much, but quantitative research has to do with quantities, numbers, statistics. So it's all about numerical data. It's all about surveys, questionnaires, this kind of thing. Whenever you see big claims about, let's say, as I said here, a population of the UK, or something, or Chinese students, something that's very inclusive, usually that comes from quantitative research. Especially, of course, depends what kind of claims you hear. But if you hear something that's very general, like I said, because specifically quantitative research is very often about generalizing the findings. So you pull a sample of a certain population, and then if you design that sample accordingly in a good and a structured way, you can, in fact, make claims about the full population. Which means, if you read a study about males in the UK, there is not a single study that would have investigated or asked every single male in the UK about something. But what it means is that they designed their population, the research population research group, in such a way that they can make claims about the general population. Maybe they talk to 500 or 1,000 males in the UK, but they are representative of the whole population through what kind of males they involve in the study. So then they can say that males in the UK, in fact, do this or do that. So that's one of the key strengths of quantitative research, that you can make these claims. Another one is that you can predict the future in a way, because through analyzing certain patterns or things that have been happening in quantitative research, you can, again, if you design the study properly, you can make claims about the future. So it's likely that this will happen again in the future. I'll come back to that claim or that characteristic shortly. And the main weakness is that it's not suitable if you want to investigate specific individual stories, problems, experiences, beliefs, attitudes. Quantitative research gives you this, like I said, opportunity to generalize, to explore these large populations. But if you really want to know the details of how what it's like to be a certain person going through a certain experience, what it's like to be a nurse going through whatever, the COVID pandemic, what it's like to be a person who's diagnosed with some difficult condition, this is something that quantitative research is not meant to really explore. Of course, you can still have some questions in the questionnaire or survey about it, but it's generally not the main thing that it will help you explore. So that's when qualitative research comes in, of course. So qualitative research is about qualities, which means basically the characteristics, what it's like to go through certain experience, what it's like to be a certain person. So this is what qualitative research is about. It's much more detailed, subjective. It focuses on usually on people, on cases, which are basically the units, whatever we try to analyze, whether it's a individual person or individual school, institution, a class, or a workplace. But it's much more targeted and focused on quantitative research. Let me see if I missed anything here, but generally, yeah, the aim is usually not to generalize. You can still make claims about how transferable or how applicable the finding is to a broader population. So it's not that you can do that, but you cannot make certain claims. You can't say that because I talked to a handful of males, again, males in a certain school in the UK. I definitely don't want to start making claims about this broad population of males in the UK. So there are weaknesses and strengths, of course, of each. And then you have mixed methods research. Again, no time to talk about that, but it's a study where you're mixing both, you're involving both methods. Quantitative methods, qualitative methods, they are supplementing each other. There are different designs for a mixed method study. Sometimes you start with a qualitative study to then develop, for example, a survey. So you want to use the findings from your first stage for maybe talking to people in an interview, and you're using that to develop a survey. And sometimes you may start with a survey, but then follow it up with talking to people to understand the results a little bit better. So that's the mixed method design. And both of these designs, qualitative, quantitative, they complement each other. And by that, what I mean is, if you want, for example, so here we can see, a crossing. If you want to imagine, there are lots of accidents taking place every year in this spot, or around this spot. Now, depending on what we want to find out, we can employ qualitative or quantitative methods. So that's just an example I usually give. So if, for example, we conduct a quantitative study, we can measure, we can observe, we can measure the statistics, numbers, and lots of different things to understand how many accidents happen here. So people jaywalking, they are walking without, the lights, the traffic lights, and there are accidents. We can measure, we can understand how many accidents, we can understand every detail of, draw correlations, understand what time of the day this happens, how it happens. And then, like I said, we can even predict how many people are likely to be killed next year based on that information. But we probably won't understand why people choose to cross in this particular spot. So that's what my qualitative study would do. If I'm more interested in the motivation, why are you doing that? Why are you using this crossing and not some other? Maybe, they have a good reason for that. That's when I want to talk to people rather than have this large scale quantitative study. So it sums up, the differences. They are both valuable. They are just valuable for different purposes. So now onto the research cycle. In any research, whatever it is, you start by asking questions. You want to know something, just like I said earlier. You want to know something, you're asking questions. That's what starts the whole process of developing a study. Once you have your questions posed, you need to decide who will give you the answers or what will give you the answers. Where do you find the answers? You're asking a question, who or what kind of data in general, what document will give me the answer. So that's the general cycle. And then you decide how you get these answers. In other words, if I'm asking a question again, or let's say I'm asking a question how effective or how good remote learning is, then I'm deciding who I want to ask. Of course, this question that I just mentioned is pretty general, but let's say among certain population, among certain school, then I'm deciding who will give me the answers. Do I want to talk to teachers? Do I want to talk to students? Do I want to talk to both?
Yep.
And then finally, I kind of said it already, but how do I get these answers? So specifically, do I want to talk to them? Do I want to observe? Do I want to measure their results, their performance, or maybe have a mixture of all these? So that's generally a cycle. Posing a question, deciding where do I go to find answers, and then how do I find answers? Again, obviously it's a simplification, but very roughly and generally this is the process. But before we start, we also have to make sure that we have a clear rationale. So this is extremely important. No way to overemphasize the importance of a rationale. Rationale is the argument, basically, the case as you build it for the need to conduct this study. So it's not enough just to say, here is my research question, or it's a good research question. What is equally, if not more important, is to say, why do we need to answer? Why is it important? And this is a common problem. So I talk to students, and one of the common problems, so from now on, most of my slides will talk about something and then mention at least a few common problems, like here, not starting with the research questions or unclear and convincing rationale. So not starting with the questions. A common problem is people saying things like, I want to conduct an interview study, or we'll talk about methodologies later, but I want to conduct a grounded theory study. That's their starting point, and it's not a good starting point. Your starting point needs to be a question. I want to find out, and then your research question. So that's how you start. And also another common problem that I mentioned, unclear or unconvincing rationale. Again, super important. Quite often I hear or see questions, research questions that seem to be well defined. I see a research proposal where you have a good idea of what you're going to do, who you're going to talk, how you're going to gather that information. You've really thought the whole process through. However, I ask such student or whoever they are, or maybe a client, why do we need to find these answers in the first place? And sometimes they struggle, and it's not a good sign if this happens. You have to be able to straight away explain and demonstrate why it is important to know these things. What will knowing this change? I had when I was doing my my PhD, one of my supervisors said that just because there is no study into something, or just because we don't understand it, does not mean that there is a need to understand it. So that's a very important thing. There may not be a study into, diet of or behaviors of my dog, for example, is lying there and having a nap at the moment. So it's a huge gap in research. Nobody has ever attempted to do that. But as you know, as you probably figured out, there is no need for that. So I don't have a strong rationale. Who will benefit from it? So you always have to explain the rationale. Who's going to benefit? It could be anything. It can be to add more evidence to what we already know. It doesn't always have to be groundbreaking. So that's also a very common misconception. We hear all this talk about research gap, finding a gap. We're obsessed with a research gap. As students, we're constantly being told about that gap. It doesn't have to be a gap in a traditional sense. So maybe there are already studies doing that. Maybe you're just adding more evidence. But in any case, you need to explain why we're doing that study. And this kind of links to implications. So something that we talk about at the end of our study. So who's going to benefit? How? What are we going to do with these findings? You have to have all these answers straight away. So that's the beginning. And then we go into the research questions. Like I said, you have this strong rationale. We have you're now thinking about your research questions. Our research questions really do tell us everything about the study. So one of the first things that I ask of clients as a consultant or data analyst, depending again on the nature of the project, are the research questions, because they tell me everything about the study. They even tell me what the design of the study will be. So that's how strongly they are linked to the design, the methods, and everything else. So what I mean by that, this is also one of the common problems. People have questions that are not suitable for the research design that they have in mind. So if I see a question saying, does watching Netflix influence students' performance or students' grades? If I see a question like that, in general, it's not a great question. I can imagine many problems with that. It would be extremely difficult to isolate that variable, watching Netflix, and demonstrate that that's in fact something that has an influence on their grades. But these problems aside, is this question, if I see this question, straight away, I know it's a quantitative study. It's not a qualitative study, because you're asking about the influence between variables, essentially. Does watching Netflix influence the grades? This is not the kind of a question that a qualitative researcher usually asks, because in qualitative research, we can't really talk about relationships, because there is no way for us to demonstrate that there is a relationship. Even if it seems obvious, it seems that there must be, there is no other way. We can't really make claims about relationships or correlations in qualitative research. That's just something for you to remember also when you analyze the data, when you talk about the results of the analysis. So if you ask a question, you can even tweak it just slightly. If you say, what are the perceptions of the relationship between Netflix and grades, or something like that, then it's a completely different story. I already know because of the word perceptions, or sometimes perceived. So what is the perceived relationship between X and Y? When I see a question like that, then again, it's the other way around, the opposite. I straight away know we're talking about qualitative study because of that little word, perceived. So I know we're talking about perceptions of something. So which means that I'll probably explore these perceptions, which means that it's going to be a qualitative study. So that's how strongly research design links to the research questions. You have to be very careful. I very often see questions. So somebody talks to me about the rationale, and then they have research question that does not even sound like we're talking about the same study. So you have to be very careful with that. Good research questions are focused, they are specific, and they are doable. So you don't want very broad and general research questions, like I said, that talk about the scale of the whole country, or something that's extremely ambitious. That's also a very common mistake among students. Again, quite often being under pressure, they feel like surely they have to be, much more ambitious than this narrow and focused idea that they have. But actually, something I say very often is that it's actually best to be very narrow and very focused, to do one thing but do it right. So don't think about, straight away, again, the impact of the COVID pandemic on whatever, on the job situation, the job market, in a qualitative study. But if you're talking about, specific experience, so the impact of pandemic on, nurse satisfaction in a certain institution, something like that. So just focus on a very specific thing, have very specific research questions, and don't try to cover too much with one study. It's never good to do that. It's going to be difficult, very impractical, and generally the study won't be perceived as having as much value as I said, a study that's very focused and contributes to this one thing. So that's just a few things about research questions. Too many questions are not good, because then again, I hear a good rationale, but then I see a long list of questions, and they are kind of all over the place. And again, me being mainly a data analyst, that's what I do most of the time. I analyze data. Straight away, when I see such a long list of questions, I have a headache knowing what the student is getting, themselves into, trying to later answer all these questions. So there is no rule for how many questions. It's very common to have between 1 and 3, sometimes a few sub questions. But again, there is no rule. You can have one research question in your study. But I would say in qualitative research, you would have less than in quantitative research. In quantitative research, it's more common to have 9, 10 questions. Definitely, you don't want to do that in qualitative research. So, as I said, following the questions, you start thinking about what type of data do I need to gather to answer these questions. So that's the logic, that's the chronology of decision making when you're planning a study. Remember, you need to have a strong rationale, good reason for doing a study, certain questions that you're trying to answer. After that, you're thinking, how would I answer these questions? What information do I need to gather? Maybe it's enough to go and look at social media posts, because maybe I want to see, you know, what TikTok users or people on a certain other platform, how they make sense of something, or how they discuss, what language do they use to talk about a certain politician. Or maybe, you know, or maybe, like I said, I'm interested in experiences of students in a specific kind of educational setting. Or maybe I'm interested in an experience of Chinese students who are being taught put in groups, taught, you know, where group work is implemented. I want to know, because in group work is, I know, extremely popular arrangement, and especially in Western institutions, but then quite often in other contexts, it's not so common. It's not so popular, and it could be worth exploring how they. I mean, and in fact, there are plenty of studies into that, how this group of students perceive group work. Here, maybe in a certain UK university. So, so you have to have an idea for who do I need to talk to, or, you know, what kind of information do I need in general. You don't always have to talk to somebody. So what demographics, how many participants, you know, and all these decisions. Yeah, what I say here, you know, answer research questions, nothing more, nothing less. And this is, again, something that is applicable at every stage. Something that sounds obvious, but it's one of the most powerful and important things that I always say, because people panic. This happens a lot when you're analyzing the data, but also when you're planning your study, when you're gathering the data. Just think, just think about your actual genuine desire to answer the research question, and don't be afraid to make decisions, and you know, take ownership of your study and make decisions, and just think about that study and these research questions. Do not overthink it. Do not think that you probably are expected to do something else, or maybe add more methods, or maybe add more participants. You have to be convinced in your own decisions. So I know it's not always easy, but it's just something to remember. Of course, it helps, you know, to be convinced. It helps to have some evidence, you know, some information that you will use to argue for these claims. But nevertheless, this is very important. Just remember that answering these research questions is all you need, because common problems are, again, trying to recruit too many participants. For example, I hear about, you know, a qualitative research study, as I said, something that's very focused, very specific, very well defined in terms of the research questions, but then straight away somebody says they will talk to 55 or 60 nurses or business owners. And my question straight away is, why? Why so many? Why do you think you need to talk to 60? Sometimes there is a reason for that. Or maybe you want to conduct a study where you're comparing different companies, so the total could be more. Maybe you're talking to 4 different companies, you know, 15 participants in each, and then it's a total of 60. So you know, so there are circumstances, and I am aware of it. Of course, there are studies where, you know, qualitative studies where you have large samples, but as I said, you need to have a good reason for that. If you just told me you're interested in business owners' perspectives, or, like I said, student perspectives, perceptions of group work or remote learning, and you're planning to recruit 60 students, it's just a large number. You probably won't need it. And then you may have also a sample that's too small, but then all these discussions are very vague, because firstly, because there is not a single answer to how many participants is enough in a qualitative study. It's all about quality, not quantity, just as the name suggests. So sometimes you may have a study with 3 participants, 5 participants. There are studies that only explore 1 participant views on a specific topic. So it can be like a narrative life story of one person. So it really depends what you're trying to explore. Again, as a student, more often than not, you'll have some pressure from the institution, from your supervisors, and it's very difficult to convince them, for example, to have a study with only 3 or 4 participants. But it does happen. For phenomenology, we'll talk about methodology soon. Phenomenology, which is all about what it's like to be a certain person going through a certain experience. It's a detailed inquiry into a lived experience of something. So for these studies, for example, it's more acceptable to have less participants, because the interviews are much more in-depth. They're longer, quite often longitudinal, over a certain period of time. the analysis is more in-depth. The reporting is more in-depth because it's focusing on the whole, basically, story or experience of each person. So these studies have less participants. So it really depends. It really depends. Again, I won't have time to give you answer, to cover every single approach, every single design. But what I'm trying to communicate, because you'll still have to go and do some reading, you'll have to go and do some learning, but to communicate that there is never a single answer and there is always flexibility. And again, you always have to think about the decisions as they apply to your specific study, not because somebody said that in a book that it's a good idea. For example, that on average 25 participants is enough, because on average 25 participants is enough in grounded theory studies, which is a specific methodology. So there are studies also comparing averages across different methodologies, and then they tell you on average this is the number that people use, for example, when they do a case study or a grounded theory. But as you can see, again, if you're not doing a grounded theory study, then it's a useless information and it's not relevant that in some studies 25 is an average. So problems with demographics, what I mean here, so again, lots of problems with sampling. Do not go, well, too crazy on when it comes to the sample, when it comes to different characteristics of the sample. So trying to make it heterogeneous, which is sample that covers that has people with different characteristics. So you may think, sometimes there are studies where you may think, okay, I need females and I need males, because how would I justify just males? But then somebody will say, how about different religions? And then how about different cultural backgrounds? How about people who are single and who are married? How about sexual orientation? So there are so many things, and I've seen studies that were trying to cover, without a good reason, so many different characteristics. Again, don't worry about it. Usually it's not needed. Usually your research question, your whole rationale and idea will help you decide who you need for your study. So if I'm interested, let's say, again, Chinese students' experience of group work at a university, it's reasonable to assume that if I just go at the university that I have access to, I take a classroom of Chinese students and I manage to recruit them, or most of them, for my study, that's going to be enough. Then I will describe their characteristics, but I won't decide, I won't say, okay, in that classroom, I don't have enough females, I don't have enough people of that religion or something else, because this is, in fact, fairly representative. It's just basically a random classroom, and they are Chinese. That's important because my study was about Chinese students. So don't worry about trying to cover all these differences, because again, we're not doing a quantitative study where the sample has to be representative. It's a completely different story. In quantitative study, you want it to be representative, which means that you do pay a lot of attention to making this sample representative, to actually consisting of similar proportions and similar characteristics as the wider population of the whole country or all Chinese students. Here in qualitative research, it's focused. I'm just taking a classroom or people I have access to. So don't worry about that. Data collection methods. So as I said, we're deciding on our people or data or sample, wherever we need to go to gather that information. And then we're deciding usually, how do we gather that information? Again, I won't cover every single method, of course. So we have so many different methods: interviews, focus group discussions, journals, documents, observations, group interviews, which are different from focus group discussions, and many, many more. You have art-based research recently gaining more popularity. So research where you can use artwork. You have different hands-on workshops and things. So lots of things. Here are a few rules. How many methods to have, for example, and this is, again, there is a lot of pressure for a thing called triangulation. Maybe you've heard that. There are different types of triangulation, but basically one of the types of triangulation is triangulation of data collection methods, which means that to make the findings more valid, more trustworthy, you would like to gather information from different sources, which makes sense. Again, common sense thing, if you think about it. Remember, we're natural born researchers, and if a child goes and ask a certain question and ask the dad first and then go and ask the mom and then ask the sister, that's also triangulation. It's not triangulation of data collection methods because it's all, let's say, an interview, but it's triangulation of data, of so sources of data. 3 different people, I'll ask 3 different people and see it's more convincing than if I just ask one person. So that's triangulation. Triangulation of data collection methods is, okay, I'll ask the students how they feel about group work, but I also observe how they work in groups, and maybe I'll compare, exam scores. So I'm triangulating. I'm just adding more evidence, or maybe I'll talk to people. I'll talk to nurses, see how they deal, with their work in the hospital. But then I'll also ask them to fill in their diaries, reflective diaries. It will give me some more ideas because maybe they forget to tell me something during the interview. So this is triangulation. But then you hear a lot about triangulation, and again, there is a lot of pressure to do it, to the point where we're almost led to believe that we absolutely have to have more than one method of data collection, which is not true because, again, not always easy to convince your supervisor because usually that's where the pressure comes from. But it's completely fine to have a study, for example, that's just an in-depth interview-based study. You're just talking to people. So don't worry about it. That's, again, the same thing. Don't do something just because you feel like maybe you're expected to do more. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to add an additional data collection method. People have they add focus groups, they add diaries, documents to their studies, and then I ask them, and again, they can't even tell me why. And I'm telling them, what exactly are you expecting to find in these documents? Why won't you just ask people? So again, prioritize your research question, your idea, your rationale. So don't look at anything other than that. So that's what it says. Trust your instinct. Be in charge. So just like I mentioned, when I talked about research questions, don't use a method just because it's popular. It's what happened when I was a student. Again, and one of my supervisors, she loved focus groups. She kept insisting and insisting and insisting on me adding a focus group discussion to my study. My study was based on interviews, and it was about Polish migrants' experiences in the UK. It was specifically focusing on their language identity, how they express themselves through language, how they feel. Do they feel like different people when they speak a language that's not their mother tongue? So I had a detailed study based on interviews. She insisted on focus groups. And then I finally read enough about focus groups to give her a reason why I didn't feel like it was a good method for that study. So because I just didn't feel that they would open up as a group because it was about very specific experiences. Anyway, here is another tip. So if you're working with supervisors, something that I very often say to students, most of your decisions can be defended if you have good evidence to support that choice. Supervisors will always eventually back off if they see that your decision is informed, basically, and it comes from research and reading. If you just say I don't want to do a focus group, they will keep insisting. But if you say I don't want to do a focus group because I read that ideally focus groups should have, for example, people from, let's say, shared experience, and maybe my participants won't have it. So whatever is your decision, if you prepare well, usually you can argue, you can defend it. So that's just kind of a side note. Let's see, common problems. As I said, many data collection methods just for the sake of it, but they won't help you. Sometimes it's good to have one specific data collection method. That's really all you need. Of course, unsuitable methods for the research questions, such a common problem. Similar to research questions that do not really reflect the rationale, as I said earlier. Here, it's common to have a certain research question, and then the methods that again, I'm wondering, are we still talking about the same study? We remember when I said that I'm looking at the research question and straight away, I know it's going to be, for example, a quantitative study or a qualitative study. So same, if I'm reading about, I'm looking at a research question that's asking about specific experiences of people going through, a specific experience or specific, life event. And then I can see that you have a large scale questionnaire survey and maybe you're analyzing documents. And whilst, I can see how some of these things can probably be inferred from this kind of a data, obviously, if I hear that your main interest, your main focus is to explore experience or perceptions or beliefs, of course, I would expect that that you would have, interviews as your data collection method, at least one of them. So yeah, just sometimes, it just strikes me that when I see the general research idea and research questions, and then I see the methods that don't seem to be the best method for exploring that. And this again goes back to be in charge, be confident, be in charge, and also how everything is related. You can see how going from the rationale through the research questions, choosing your participants or sources of the data, choosing your data collection methods, it's all related. It's all related, and you just have to always be focused just on these things and nothing else. So keep your research questions in mind and just don't be afraid to make decisions about that. So to decide what you think is the best method. Some of the best, most interesting methods that I've seen were coming from also students. Every now and then I come across a student who tells me about their study, and they just came up with something that I could never think of. So something very creative, but also it just makes perfect sense that that's where they will look for answers to their research. So even if it's not something that you've read in a textbook, sometimes it's, it doesn't mean you can't do it. So yeah, so just think where to gather that information. What's the best place? Methodologies. So methodologies, as I said earlier, there is a lot of confusion when it comes to different terminologies. So in the terminology that I usually follow and I find just easy to remember and follow, methodology is definitely not qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method. As I mentioned, these are research designs. So you have qualitative, quantitative, mixed method research. And then underneath is so within qualitative research, you have different methodologies. And they are not methods of data collection. They are not methods of data analysis. They are methodologies. Methodologies are like templates for doing research. So sometimes you have a whole group of decisions, including what kind of methods I'm using, what is my general aim of the study, the rationale, what kind of study am I doing. All these things, they are included in a methodology. It's like a package that is meant to make it easier because for you, because maybe I'm doing a detailed exploration of live experience, lived experience. Like I said, what does it mean to be, or what is it like to be a person going through this, like I said, or being diagnosed with some terminal, condition. I want to know that. So this is lived experience. I want to just talk to 3 or 4 people. I want to spend a lot of time talking to them. I won't find, it will be very difficult to find more for such a, challenging study. Of course, there will be plenty of problems with ethical, decisions. But that's what I'm trying to do. I want it to be very detailed. I want to really explore and describe, each person's experience. So that, for example, means I can probably choose phenomenology as the methodology for my study, because phenomenology is specifically about exploring lived experiences. The sample sizes tend to be smaller. The aim is to really explain and take the reader through this experience. So there are different methodologies like that. Grounded theory is for studies where something is really under-researched, understood. There is not that much in terms of previous findings and research, and therefore grounded theory is aiming to generate a detailed understanding, not necessarily a theory, which is the word that quite often puts people off and overwhelms them. You don't really have to develop a theory, but you're trying to develop a detailed explanation of something that's happening, usually some process or phenomenon. There is not much that we know from the literature. That's why, again, the strong emphasis is on the findings being grounded in the data, developing from our data. It needs to be very inductive, which means I'm not going to use previous theories. I'm going to find what my participants say, and I'm going to develop this understanding and this explanation from this data. And so this means I'm doing grounded theory. There is a whole bunch of decisions in grounded theory, so they have their own preferred data analysis methods. They have their own preferred sampling procedures. again, it's a whole package that I may use. Action research is for developing, it's a dynamic methodology where you're exploring certain change, so certain intervention quite often. If you do it in educational settings, there may be a problem and maybe I want to fix that problem. So I'll be doing, it's an action research cycle where I'll do some training for teachers, then they will teach their lesson, then I will compare, see the results. Did it help? If it didn't help, I'll do some more tweaking, some more adjustments, and then I'll teach them again, and then they'll teach their class again. So it's a cycle, action research cycle. So there is a, so these are different situations, different methodologies you can choose from, but you don't have to. So that's the thing. A common misconception is that you have to choose it. Again, unfortunately, many supervisors are forcing that, and it's absolutely not true. You do not have to choose a methodology. You don't have to say it's a case study or a grounded theory study. It's enough to just say it's a detailed qualitative exploration of something. But quite often, again, there is this external pressure. Another common problem is when we try to force things into, again, my decision, instead of saying, I want to understand the experience of this group of people, instead I'll be saying, I want to conduct a grounded theory study. That's a mistake, because then I'll be using that as the guiding principle of my study, and then I'll be forcing things into grounded theory, and people do that a lot. Big mistake. So my students, they say, I'm conducting a grounded theory study. This means I need to recruit participants this way, and then this means I need to analyze data this way. But the question is, do you think you need to analyze data this way? Because maybe you're not supposed to do a grounded theory study if the answer is no. So do not let that guide your decisions. Maybe, so basically, after you decide on everything else, if it happens that this seems to fit a certain methodology, then you can start thinking about, okay, maybe I am doing a grounded theory study after all, but do not let that be the first thing you decide. Data analysis. So as you can see, I'm going through all different stages. This is a long topic. This is mainly what I teach also in workshops and in university lectures where I teach, and also on my YouTube channel. You can find, if you type my last name, you'll find me on YouTube. A lot of it is about data analysis. I will never manage to cover, a quarter of that in this lecture, but generally you'll find, again, I would advise you, if you're struggling or you're trying to learn about data analysis, I would really strongly advise you to watch some of the videos I post. But generally, I usually simplify the process of qualitative data analysis into 3 steps, a 3-step guide. My argument is that almost every approach, almost every methodology, although they absolutely love to be perceived as being unique, they are not. They are very similar. A grounded theory, phenomenology, narrative research, all of them share the same characteristics. And when it comes to data analysis, you have different frameworks. You have Brown and Clark with their 6-stage framework, and you have others, but they are really all the same. Data analysis is much more straightforward and much more common sense than you probably think it is. It's always about reducing the volume of the data, developing some final findings, whether we call them themes or categories. It depends again on the approach. But usually the goal is to develop some certain big topics, certain trends and patterns, something that is in our data. Several, like I said, between 1 and maybe 5 or 6 or 7 major things in the data, topics running through the data. I'll call them themes, because that's, again, the terminology I choose to follow. So that's the goal. But because you can't just look at your data and decide on these things, this would mean that your approach is not valid, it's not trustworthy, because you could be biased. You could be biased. You could
Hello.
forget. Yeah. Okay. Can you please, for now, can we make sure that we're muted? If you have any questions, I'll be answering them very soon. Yeah. So because you can't just come up with these answers just looking at the data, you have to reduce that volume of the data. You have to somehow summarize all that data, all that information that you're gathering, to make sure that you're not missing anything, to make sure that what you believe to be the final findings is actually accurate, it represents what your participants say, rather than your maybe assumptions, your expectations. So with this in mind, the goal of data analysis is to reduce that information, to break it down into pieces, and then basically from these pieces develop your final findings, which means that whatever your approach, usually start with coding the data. Again, there's not enough time to go through all these processes, but coding is generally like almost summarizing, generating little tags or little descriptions of everything as you're reading your data. Let's say your interview transcripts. Once you've coded your data, you have a lot of codes, you have a lot of mess. For that moment, you'll feel even more overwhelmed. But that's stage 2, where you start to organize and group your codes just to make sense of them a little bit better. Because they will be, like I said, lots of codes and lots of mess. And eventually from that organized, grouping of your codes, what starts to develop or emerge to you are these general topics, because you now understand your data so much better than when you're just overwhelmed with all these transcripts or all that information. So it's really about 3 stages: coding, organizing the codes, and developing your final answers, your final themes. Like I said, this is something specifically that I cover extensively in my YouTube videos, and there is a video pretty popular. It's about, I think, coding explained in 3 minutes or something like that. So I go through all these stages. Then you have all these considerations, whether you're using software, you're using AI. Again, lots of decisions to be made, but you have to have in mind always this process and what you really need to do. Just break down that data, reduce it to these codes, organize the codes, find the answers to the research questions. What's not helping is that the literature is making it sound like it's so much more detailed, so much more sophisticated and overwhelming, this whole process. That's the main thing. That's how I started in general my business, following my graduation and some research assistant positions and a little bit of teaching. I developed the whole research consulting idea and business specifically to be able to talk about these things in a way that's easier than what we usually see in the textbooks, because the textbooks just make it sound complex and complicated with no reason. And data analysis does not really have to be complicated. So common problems, sticking to certain approach. You do have certain
विजय भाई।
frameworks. I can hear you.
हाँ नमस्कार, क्या हाल चाल है भैया? कहाँ हैं आप? क्या
Can we just for now, can we just
Yes, sir.
ignore?
Yes, sir. It's muted. It's muted.
Okay. So anyway, again, I say at the bottom, I say keep in mind the goal is to answer your research questions, because that's the goal, and it's more true than ever when it comes to data analysis, because again, I have so many clients and students and workshops where people are stuck. They have maybe coded the data and now they're stuck. They don't know what to do, or how do these themes emerge? Like, how does that happen? What does it even mean? But then again, the goal is just look at the codes, think about your research questions, and decide, okay, the codes are telling you everything that you need to know about your data. How can you answer the research questions now? So that's essentially the goal of data analysis. But like I said, it's I'm more than happy to talk about it when you have questions, if you have questions about data analysis, because there is so much to cover. Using software, generally, these days, it will be extremely unusual not to use any software. I mean, like, do it completely manually on a piece of paper. Some people still choose to do it, but this is usually because they feel overwhelmed. They are not confident about using software. But believe me, it only makes things much more difficult. So definitely use software. Usually institutions provide some access to some software. There are dedicated packages. NVivo is the one I use, but then you have MaxQDA, Quirkos, any software. I have videos again on my YouTube channel where I talk about even using Microsoft Word. Anything that is not even meant to be a data analysis software, but some sort of software that you can use to group all these codes and that information, because otherwise it's very difficult. And then, of course, these days, it's funny how every time I provide some sort of a training, I updated the part where I talk about AI. Not long ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was just mentioning it briefly, saying there is an option on basically on the horizon about AI tools. These days, it seems to be the most dominating tool and dominating approach that people use. So yes, you can use AI for data analysis, but again, be very careful. Again, I have lots of videos and training for that, but if you do decide to use it. Of course, as you're probably aware, these days the use of AI is kind of gray area because there is no agreement for what's allowed, what's not allowed. Usually it has to do with your autonomy and whether you're using it as a tool, something that does things for you that you're asking it to do, or are you using it as something that will do basically your work for you, which is usually not okay. So lots of things to consider here, but I'll talk about it if you want me to talk about it. Even if you use ChatGPT for data analysis, which is absolutely possible, not the easiest way because it's you have to really control it to make sure that it does it right. But you can do it. You can use, for example, ChatGPT for qualitative data analysis, but to do it right, you have to have a very good understanding of what is qualitative data analysis. What do we do? What are the processes? What do we have to do at stage 1, at stage 2, at stage 3? Once you have understanding of that, you can guide, ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever you're using to effectively analyze the data. But it has to start with your understanding. So yeah, lots of things here, but like I said, I guess the key message: do not worry, because it's data analysis is much easier than that you may think it is. It's really just about reducing somehow all that information and understanding everything that everybody said, putting it all together so they can convincingly demonstrate, here is one of the key topics they discussed, in my data. Here's another topic they discussed. So that's what it is, really. Additional considerations, because we will be moving into questions very soon. Just a bunch of things that you may have heard about. Again, way too detailed, each one of these topics to really cover them in a lot of detail, but validity and reliability, validity of your findings. Reliability is really not that much of a problem in qualitative research. It's more of a quantitative term. Reliability generally says it's about replicability. Validity is about how trustworthy the findings are. Reliability is not so relevant because in qualitative research, even if two people analyze the same data with similar methods, the results are always going to be slightly different. There will probably be, hopefully, similar, but there will be differences. It's not like science or maths where they will be exactly replicated. So it's more common to talk about validity of your findings. So basically, how can they be trusted? Can your findings be trusted? Were they the results you're showing me, the findings you're showing me, are they actually the findings, or are they maybe something that you really wanted to find and expected to find? How do I know that your bias did not influence what the results, what you're showing me? So that's what validity is about. And there are just strategies and methods to increase validity of your findings. There's a whole bunch of strategies for that. They're optional. Again, there is no rule saying you have to use certain strategies and not the others, but there are things like member check-in, which is basically double checking with your participants when after you've gathered the information, you're sitting and analyzing it at home, and then you're not sure, for example, if that person during the interview, if that's what she meant, rather than assuming that that's what she meant, what she meant is what I think she meant, I may send her an email and say, look, I'm working on this transcript, you said this, am I right in assuming that that's what you meant? So that's member check-in, that's checking with your participants. Not all the time, just if there is any doubt. Then other things like audit trail, so keeping a detailed documentation of everything that you do, so that somebody can have insight into how did you come up with these findings. So there are just strategies to increase validity of your findings. Limitations is just a quick point. The only thing I usually say is it's a very important part. You have to talk about limitations of your study, but because people hate talking about their weaknesses, that's the perception usually. I don't want to talk about the weaknesses of my study. What if they will mark my study down because of that? What I always say, remember that people who are reading about your study, your examiners, your supervisors, maybe people in the journal where you're submitting your journal article, they do know about the limitations of your study. It's not like you're trying to hide something. They will know. Talking about limitations is admitting and acknowledging that you also know that you don't think your study was ideal, it was perfect. It's also a good way to showcase your additional knowledge and your understanding or critical thinking, lots of things, just by showing that you're considering all these other things. So definitely do talk about limitations. Don't worry about that. And the worldviews is a whole different topic. It's about philosophies, and I'm not sure why I put it here because there is nowhere near enough time to talk about it. But generally, you may be expected to talk about the worldviews, like the philosophical paradigms. It's a topic that everybody absolutely hates, including myself. But usually it's something that you have to mention in your work, which means quite often, again, there is a million different categorizations and theories on that, which is really not helping. I usually follow the most general and the broadest classification, which just puts them into two very general groups, either interpretivist views or positivist views, which are basically, in a nutshell, qualitative and quantitative, because the positive views are more about scientific approach and the interpretivist views are more about the subjective approach. Just something you have to talk about. Ideally, it's much easier to talk about it once you're already in the process of study or even after you conducted it. Just one thing, if you ever have any choice. Usually you're expected to talk about it before the study, which makes it much more difficult because for a normal, regular person, it's not something we just think about, our worldviews and philosophical paradigms. But then after you've conducted your study, it's much easier to infer what your worldviews could have been, or what they probably are based on your decisions on what you did. So this is just a general advice. Yeah, I really want to go to the Q&A because we have half an hour, and like I said, I really want to start answering your questions. I know it was fast, lots of things to cover, but this is the whole process. So again, I covered the process from developing your idea, research questions, or rationale, and then all the way through data analysis, hopefully giving you some insights about common considerations, like I said, and common problems.
Thank you, sir. It was a very informative session, a brief one, but an informative one. And as sir had requested, I would ask our students, I would request them to put up their questions in the chat box, please, so that sir can take them up and he can hopefully solve your queries. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, so go ahead and I thought I saw the chat. I was hoping there was a few questions, but it's basically about some organizational stuff. Go ahead and ask your questions. You can put them in the chat or just directly ask. Although it would be easier if you put them in the chat because then we have them, documented and recorded as well, and I can read them. Otherwise, just let me know what you want me to talk about. I can just talk about more about something that I already said. Maybe something wasn't clear. Just feel free to use that time and ask me. Maybe you're interested about what I said about AI or anything else. Just do let me know. Okay, nothing yet, but how do we evaluate the validity or reliability of a research paper? So that's what so this is one of these final points. Reliability. So the way I learned about validity and reliability, I remember this book. I'm trying to see if it's here. So it's probably not here. I think. Well, all I remember is that the author is Thompson. I'm sure there will be probably hundreds of people with that last name, but anyway, this author explained in simple terms when I was really confused about these things. I think it must have been my master's study, explained validity and reliability in a really good way. So basically, reliability is whether the instrument, let me see, I now got confused. If we think about scales, bathroom scales for measuring your weight, the scales are valid if the scales are measuring how much you weigh, because they are measuring what they are supposed to measure. They are valid. If they are measuring temperature outside, it's not a valid tool for, it's not a valid tool for scales because it's not measuring what it's supposed to measure. It's not measuring your weight. And it's reliable if it's measuring consistently, giving you the same result. So if you get on the scales, off the scales, back on the scales, it's showing you the same weight. It means it's reliable. If it's showing you constantly different weight, something is wrong with the scales. So that's generally reliability and validity. So as I said, in qualitative research, reliability is not so much an issue because it's always going to be slightly different. Like I said, general patterns, trends, themes, they will be similar, but they won't ever be exactly the same. In quantitative research, it's completely different because it's all about numbers, statistics, like I said, almost like maths or science. It has to be the same if you're doing certain statistical tests. So we're talking about reliability, but in qualitative research, we're talking about validity mainly. So how, like I said, trustworthy the results are. So if you're evaluating the validity of a study, of a research paper, you're focusing on these things, like do they provide, evidence for, well, basically to convince us that it was well structured. Maybe triangulation, another thing that I mentioned earlier, that they had different sources of data collection, that they had enough participants, that their qualitative data analysis process is described properly. So we can trust them. We know that they didn't just come up with these findings. So basically it's assessing whether it's a credible study. That's mainly the validity. And reliability, like I said, can be, sometimes people talk about it in qualitative research, but it can easily be dismissed because it's a very problematic concept in qualitative study. Let's see, recap. I'm just going through your comments now. So recap the definition of method and methodology with example. Well, method, it can be, again, some people talk about method as qualitative study or grounded theory as a method because it depends on terminology and it can be very confusing. The terminology that I tend to stick to, and it's very common way of describing things, methodology is like a method can be data analysis method. It can be a data collection method. So they are very specific things, how you collect the data, interviews, focus group data analysis methods, or, thematic analysis, narrative analysis. There are different ways also to analyze the data. Methodology is broader. It's like, I said, a template, framework for doing your study. So within a certain methodology, let's say grounded theory study, there will be certain methods. There will be, for example, interviews, focus groups. So data collection methods, they go into a methodology. Methodology is like a broader concept, like a broader framework for doing certain study. So again, like I said, if you're doing a study in a certain area or maybe interested in lived experiences, your sample tends to be smaller or bigger, then eventually you may arrive at a conclusion that, oh, this seems to fit that methodology, which is like a general kind of a, like I said, I think framework or template is the best way to describe it. So yeah, just slightly two different things. Okay, may I know I will need to select the new focus group or interview new group for data collection, or I can base it on those that have collected in the internet. Okay, oh, so you mean like somebody else collected them. You can do both, either. I mean, so the difference is we're talking about primary data or secondary data. Primary data is the data you gather for your study. It was not there before. Secondary data is the data that exists and you're using it for your study. So both are, acceptable. Secondary data, the easiest, usually the first thing that comes to mind is when we talk about like documents online or books or articles, like in systematic literature review, we're comparing other people's findings, basically. That's secondary data. We're using something that exists already, but it can also apply to people, to participants. If there is some database of, interview data, for example, or focus groups where people talked about something, but I want to dig out something different from it, I can use that, these focus groups for my own exploration because I'm interested in something else different from that original, author. Of course, there is a question of where is it coming from? Do you need the permission from that author? What is it? Is it publicly available, or maybe you're using data somebody literally gathered for their study, which quite often could also be the case and could also be acceptable, but as you'd probably expect, you would probably need some permission from them. But that's secondary data, and yeah, you can have it. You can use secondary data for your study. You don't even have to, like develop, data for your study specifically. Data analysis, like I said, long topic. So the next question is suitable data analysis method, but after gathering the data, but it's all very general, the question, because what data you're gathering, like, what are you trying to achieve and this kind of thing. It's basically what I said in the whole slide about data analysis, because that's probably on its own the biggest topic that we could discuss. So it's very difficult to say what's a suitable way to analyze the data. But like I said, in a nutshell, it can usually be boils down to 3 steps that I described. It's to code the data, group the codes, and develop from these groupings, develop your final, answers. That's all I can kind of say, when I summarize the process, because there are different methods, but usually in most qualitative studies, you'll be talking about thematic analysis, and thematic analysis can be summarized this way. So how do you know which method to use for analysis? Yeah, so and in your view, is it more complicated compared to quantitative inferential statistics? Well, in my view, it's much easier, but I'm biased, and it's a subjective view because I absolutely hate numbers, maths, and things like that. So I have no idea about quantitative methods. They scare me, and especially inferential statistics, because you have to have a very good knowledge and understanding of these things. It's just a completely different thing. But then again, it's what I talked about earlier. Your starting point should be not that. Your starting point should be, what am I trying to achieve? What am I trying to answer? And from there, you need to start building the rest. What are going to be my questions? Where do I find these questions? How do I gather this information? And then you'll eventually realize what methods you'll be using. So I would not adopt that as a starting point, to start thinking about the methods, because they are completely different things, quantitative, inferential statistics and qualitative methods. So you'll have a better idea of where your study is going, before you get to that decision. It will kind of solve itself, because you'll know if you're, which one you need to use in your study. Split research, how can we use case studies methods for comparative purpose in different locations? Again, it all depends. So the question about comparing different locations, this is a little bit like when I talked about different demographics, or like males, females, or different religions, or different locations, different backgrounds. If there is a need for it, so usually there is. If you're asking about it, then if you're thinking about a comparative study, so specifically, let's say I want to compare students in Spain and students in the US for some reason, or maybe 2 different companies and 2 different locations, because there are different cultures, and I want to see certain decisions. So in that case, let me see what the question is actually asking. Well, I mean, it depends what you're asking, but for the analysis, usually, again, it will be flexible and can be completely different for different studies. But so many times, in 9 out of 10, or probably more, 29 out of 30 studies like that, if you're asking about the procedure of analyzing the data, you'll be treating every data set separately, every case separately. So for every case or data set, you'll go through the process of, again, coding, organizing the codes, developing the themes, and then you move on to the next data set. So your other location, your other case, code, organize the codes, develop the themes here, and then you combine them and see, for example, either combine them into one final thematic framework, or combine these 2 separate thematic frameworks, analyze and compare them, and see, for example, what challenges do the students mention in this context, what challenges do they mention in this context. But usually, more often than not, same applies for any other distinctive differences in the sample. If I'm talking to, in my study, if I'm talking to parents, students, and teachers, most likely I will treat these groups separately as well in my analysis. It's just easier, because then I can combine them at the end, but I don't have to. And if I treat them all together and mix them up and code them together, it's almost impossible to later break it down into separate themes. If somebody asks, for example, okay, but can I see them separately? So yeah, so that's a short answer for that, because I just know there are so many more questions. Evidence-based research may suffice for pushing the question or theory through when presenting the defense to the instructors. Do we need to implement it with interviews, focus groups to validate? So what do you mean exactly? If you can just say maybe a little bit more and then answer. Pushing theory through when presenting defense to the instructors, but it depends what you mean. Like, are you talking about secondary data? Is that what you mean? Like, if we use evidence as like from the data? Do you need to supplement it with interviews? Because you can use you can absolutely use just secondary data, because that's the point. If you're using secondary data or trying to develop a theory, for example, based on what we know, so I want to make a strong case for how cybercrime impacts psychologically the victims of cybercrime. I can talk to people, I can have interviews in my study, or I can use hundreds and hundreds of findings from other studies to make actually a stronger case just from that secondary data, because there's so much research into that. So it really depends. You definitely don't have to have primary data, so like supplemental interviews, but again, unfortunately, and this is true for so many decisions, and not something I have influence or you have influence over. Unfortunately, many times, in many cases, the pressure, all the unnecessary pressure to do unnecessary things, comes from supervisors, and I constantly deal with that when I talk to as a consultant, for example, to students. Very often, things I say, or even they agree with me, or they want to do something right, but then they explain what the supervisor wants, and it's just ridiculous, not something I would do. But the short answer is you definitely don't need primary data. Let me just see. Yeah, okay, so you confirm that that's what you meant. So yeah, you don't need it. But of course, as a student, you would consult that with the supervisor first, and if they want it, or ideally, then you can present your evidence for why you think you don't need it. But then if they still want it, usually it means you just have to do it, which is unfortunate. Okay, let's see. A long question. Using AI to help us generate interview questions, semi-structured interview. Do you have any experience about that? Any quality research who used AI to generate interview questions? Yeah, well, it's of course you can do that. Again, I have videos about developing interview questions. I do have my own favorite approaches to do it, and I actually enjoy doing that, but I know it can also be very overwhelming. I have my approach or framework for how I develop interview questions. Usually I start with the research questions for my study. I list them, put them on a blank screen in Microsoft Word, my research questions, and then I start generating as many as possible questions, all sorts of questions, just brainstorming, that come to my mind that in any way, shape or form are relevant to the research question from every possible direction and perspective. And then eventually from that I start to kind of piece together some sort of a structure. That's usually my approach. But having said this, of course, you can use AI just to do the same, to be honest. It's always difficult to talk about these things, because I don't doubt for a second that it could do a really good job, and it will do a really good job. The question of how you talk about it is a completely different question, because if you say that and you say, my process of developing interview questions was I said to ChatGPT what my research question is, and it gave me the interview guide. I'm sure that most of the supervisors and academic scholars at the moment will have a problem with that, just because because it's AI. They will wonder if you did that right. They will talk about ethics and that. So that's a completely different discussion. Whether you say it, whether you admit it, if you admit it, how you frame it, because maybe you can say you develop your interview guide, and then you asked AI to do the same, and maybe you almost used it as it's called inter-rater reliability, where you have two different people traditionally, but it could also be these days AI and you basically develop their ideas and see, compare them, how far they are from each other. So you could do that, and you can say, I've developed the interview guide, then I asked an AI tool to do it, and basically I compared the ideas. Maybe I added a few sub questions based on that. So there are probably ways to talk about it. So yeah, so short answer, what's my opinion, and can it do a good job? I have zero doubt that it can do a really good interview guide. But I would say, because of ethics, some morals, I don't know, because of my personal preference, because I actually like the creative process of developing questions, I would probably, ideally combine a little bit of each approach. And finally, yeah, how you talk about it will strongly depend on the institution, what's allowed, what's not allowed. So this is the thing about AI, it's changing so fast that just make sure any use of AI, just make sure that you're doing that the way, or talking about it the way that's permitted. There is more and more. Like a year ago, I was asked the same questions, and my answer was simple. It was always, don't talk about it. Nobody's ready for it. Nobody likes it in the academia, even though I liked it. But I said nobody will be happy about it. Now, every month, I see more and more guidelines, more and more institutions that are accepting it because there is no way around it, or there's no running, from it. So it's just a matter of making sure that you're always saying things or describing things the way that's at the moment accepted. There is plenty of research into the use of AI and how scholars and academics are using it for different purposes. So definitely, it can definitely help, 100%. So how to formulate the topic?
Ask the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to go back to, you said something about research questions and then immediately looking at the data collection method. And you said something about experiences, about perceptions. So when research questions are phrased around those words, then you are looking to find a data collection method that sort of matches that, well, like interviews, like focus groups.
Mhm.
I am also doing a study and it's on emotional intelligence. And what I'm looking at is finding youth perceptions on emotional intelligence. And for some reason, I'm leaning towards quantitative in terms of my data collection method. And I was just wondering if this fits or if this is going to be okay, because my primary goal, again, is to just find the perception of youth as many as I can. But then I'm not sure if I'm doing this right at the moment.
Yeah. Well, again, there is the thing is, there is never one right way to do it, and there is always different ways depending on our goals and how we defend these decisions. So I could decide, for example, that I'm more interested in a large sample. I want to really explore, hundreds of people, for example, or even not hundreds, but a larger sample. I want to see how they perceive something. So it can be, something very subjective. I can still use quantitative methods, but that's if I'm happy, for example, with what we currently know about such perceptions or similar perceptions. What I mean is, let's say I'm talking again about remote work. There is or remote learning for students. Let's say there is plenty of research. There are certain we already know about certain perceptions. Let's say conducted in another country. I know convenience and lack of access to internet and technology is among the key factors that influence, for example, negatively affect remote learning in a certain context. Now, all I'm trying to do is see how true it is, for example, for my context. I'm more than happy with these findings. I'm not really interested in other findings. I want to see if, in fact, poor access to like infrastructure and internet and everything is also a problem here, which means I can easily develop a questionnaire because I already have all these findings. In the questionnaire, I'll give them options, multiple choice, select what's the key problem with remote learning and what's the best thing about it. So basically, I'm utilizing previous findings because and I can put them as questionnaire responses. That's fine. In that case, sounds like a good idea to do it. If, however, I want to know, again, is inductive. I want to generate understanding because maybe we don't know much about this context. I want to know what is the key problem, or maybe something else that we never thought about, in which case it sounds more reasonable and much more sense to have a qualitative study, to give them a chance to actually talk about it, to give myself a chance to uncover something new. So that's the key difference. That's why sometimes we have mixed methods research, like I said, where, for example, like even my own, again, PhD study, it was about this identity, such a difficult topic, such a vague and complex topic and subjective topic. So it was mainly based on interviews because not everybody even, what is even identity? So I wanted to first establish like, what is it? How do people understand it? And all these things. And then I did have a questionnaire in the follow-up in the second stage of the study, because based on that information, I could actually even decide what do I put on a questionnaire, how do I measure, what do I measure with a questionnaire. If I started with it, it'll be a problem, because how do we measure identity? What is even identity? But because I started with the qualitative method, I then develop a questionnaire based on that, because I already knew what is understood by identity. So it's a little bit different, but it's similar to this question, because it depends. It may be okay to develop a questionnaire study or survey or quantitative study of experiences if we already have some good ideas and some good reason to believe that these experiences are likely to be mentioned, because then I can develop the questionnaire items. Otherwise, usually the first instinct is, in fact, if we're talking about experience, individual things, is to have a qualitative study. But that, yeah, like I said, it doesn't mean, yeah, you can be, definitely can use both. It just depends how you defend that decision. And also you can have a quantitative study, but then have open-ended questions. For example, you can predominantly focus on experiences that we already know, again, from the literature, give them these responses on the questionnaire, but then have an open-ended response saying, what other experiences can you think of? Which means that you're still leaving that door open for additional findings, not just what we knew before. So yeah, so that's a short answer for that. I still have to go through a few more questions because we're almost done. I can't really help develop a topic because there is a question about the topic, because again, it's a very specific, very vague concept. So there are plenty of topics. You have to do a lot of reading, develop an understanding of what needs to be understood. Like I said, whether there is any research gap, whether there is any problem that we're trying to solve. Usually a good starting point is to think, what is the problem we're trying to solve? But like I said, it's very difficult to just come up with a research idea based on a question like that. The best way to develop your research questions is basically the same thing. The best way to develop research questions, you have to know what you want to know. And then it sounds, easy, because I understand that, easier said than done, but that's because of how you ask this question in the chat. Because to develop research questions, usually it's not a very difficult thing, provided that you have a good idea for what you're trying to understand. And I know that this is probably more like what you're asking actually. How do we develop, what we're trying to find out? So the rationale. So like I said, a lot of reading, exploring the further research sections in the articles we're reading, because they are the gold mine. They're telling us actually, laying it out in front of us what future research needs to do. So these are the sections to also consider. So we have to find what do we need, if there is a need, if there is a problem, if there is something that we're trying to understand. And once you do, the research questions are just the reflection of that. Like, what are you actually trying to understand? So like I said, it can be very straightforward. Ideally, they should be straightforward. They don't have to be many questions, just something that really directly asks. I think I have also lots of materials online on that. Okay, let's see. I'll soon have to wrap it up, but AI writing research paper, again, definitely not acceptable for AI just to write it. But again, it's a question of how you use AI. It can give you a structure, some ideas, structure some sections. It can write some sections, but it will be detected because there are also AI detectors. So it's a long topic, of course, now, and yeah, very long topic, and just something you have to decide. It can definitely be a great aid and great help in writing, especially for if you're a non-native English speaker. It also helps, but you have to be aware of all these ethical considerations as well. Digital tools or software for data analysis, like I said, NVivo, MaxQDA, Atlas TI, Quarkus. These are the most common software specifically for data analysis. But then these days, in the last year, you probably have 50 other AI tools. So just a matter of exploring them, because I don't know all of them. AI to come up with a research question. I don't know. I feel like AI will base its ideas on things that have been done, and basically because it can be creative, I feel like there will be a limitation of that. I feel like, well, yeah, it will. Short answer, it will come up with a research question. But one thing I always say about research and research questions is that you have to ideally, genuinely be passionate about it. People ask me about PhD, how I managed to do it. I only managed to do it because my research was based on my actual genuine interest in what I was trying to explore. And this should be really starting point for you as well. Before you do all that reading that I mentioned, usually you are interested in something. That should be your, research question. If AI develops a research question, it's just like when supervisors, in the past I said the same thing about supervisors. If they develop your research question, you'll quickly lose interest because you're exploring something, you're dedicating hours and hours of your time in your life exploring something that maybe you're not even interested in. So the short answer is yes, it probably will. But then I would still go and you still have to go and verify it, validate it, because it may come up with a question that's been answered 100 times. So I think it's easier to not use it for that particular question. Yeah, start sample size. Final thing, sample size. Again, super long topic. I have a blog article. If you type again my last name and say how many participants are enough or sample size, you'll find it. There is a method that I use. It's basically to talk about saturation, how many studies traditionally, historically have been needed to achieve saturation, which is the point where you're not developing new findings. And then you can use that as your argument for choosing sample size, because it's a super complex question. Nobody really helps with that, but yeah, there are some averages. I would say 10 to 20 is almost every time is enough in qualitative study, but very difficult to actually demonstrate that. Guide and research paper. Yeah, and yeah, the question about using it as a guide for research, like I said, yeah, you can use it for structure, for things like that. I would always say it's best to have as much of your own idea before asking AI, because it's very tempting, very easy. And I'm doing the same thing. When AI does something for me, it's very easy to kind of take a step backwards and remember what I actually think, because it quite often gives us, admittedly, very good ideas. So I would like to have a good idea myself, and then maybe, and then upload as much as possible from that to AI based on my ideas, and then ask it maybe give me a good structure for that, rather than start with AI, because I just feel like it does make me lazy when I start with AI, because then I'm already influenced by its ideas. But generally, yeah, it can definitely give you structure, because that's one of the things that it will do well, because it's basing its knowledge on so many things that have been done in the past. So it will definitely give you a very rigorous and very good structure and breakdown of a paper. So definitely, yeah. Yeah, you can reach out to me and see, and I'll try, of course, as much as possible. My schedule is extremely busy, but I'll always try, if I have a minute to answer some questions, maybe online if you reach out. I can't explain case study. We're basically done. Case study can be anything, yeah, but case is a case. It can be a single person, organization, a country. You have to define a case and then gather as much information as possible about that case. So one thing about case study, it's one of the most misunderstood methodologies, because people say, well, anything is a case, so I'm doing a case study research. The main thing, just to finish it off, one characteristic of a case study that hardly anybody talks about is that you have to provide, you have to gather information from different sources about that case. So you have one case, let's say classroom, and it's about gathering as much information as possible. So interviews, observations, exam results, that's what defines a case study. So you're really researching in depth into that case, whether it's a case is a person or a classroom or a workplace, because that's very flexible. Yeah, so that's yeah. Okay, so yeah, let's finish. And
Thank you, Dr. Jarek. Thank you for taking your time and answering all our students' queries. It was a wonderful session. And for our students, I would request you to kindly check the chat box, because I will be providing the feedback link there. So kindly click on it and fill it up with your registered email addresses. Just a heads up, our coordinator, if you email her, you'll get a mail saying that our systems are being revised and there is some system software issue. So we will start working from the 3rd of October. So kindly wait for the duration of time, and your queries will be answered by then. So thank you, sir. It was a wonderful and a brief session. This is the feedback link. So kindly check it and fill it up. And
Okay, and I'll log off now. So thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here. Yeah, and like I said, I'll try if you reach out, and remember to find me on social media on YouTube, and there is plenty, especially about AI. Recently, I post a lot about that. So nice to talk to all of you, and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody, for your cooperation. We'll be ending the meeting here. Thank you.